What I want to look at today is just the blessing that is recited after the first part of that Hallel. So in other words, this is actually the way that Jewish literature often works, is that, when you read the newspaper, the most important stuff comes first, and then it goes correspondingly lower and lower. But in Jewish liturgy, it's often that the center stuff is really the most essential. And as you move out to the beginnings and the ends, you're getting later ideas and later additions. So we're really in the center here, and the center is the first half, or the first two Psalms of Hallel. That's the end of what we call Maggid. And the very end of Maggid is that blessing that you make, the second cup. It ends with the blessing, Borei Gafen, on the second cup, but we have a blessing on redemption that takes place. So we're sort of starting at the end of Maggid. That's the essential part that wraps the meal. It's the first part of the meal, encasement with the Hallel. And we're going to look at the blessing that follows those two Psalms that we recite at the end of Maggid. So if you're in your Haggadah, if you turn to the very end of Maggid, right before you start washing for the meal, then you this is where we are looking at today. Okay, so the main thing I want to point out today is that Hallel is accompanied by a blessing and drinking of wine. Okay, we normally associate drinking of wine with Kiddush, which indeed on the Seder we do, right? That's the first thing we do, Kadesh. And traditionally, and this is clear on Seder night, drinking wine is associated with Birkat Hamazon, with the blessing after food. So you drink wine to start the meal, you drink wine to end the meal. Those are two of the four cups. The other two cups that we have, the second cup and the fourth cup, are actually tied to Hallel. And just structurally, that's sort of where we are. So if you think Hallel, you're going to also think a cup of wine and a blessing. And indeed, the way that we recite Hallel in the morning, we don't have the wine because we're not sort of in a meal situation, but we do have the blessing that follows Hallel. So let's just take a look at the structure, and then we're going to dive into the blessing itself. The idea that Hallel is accompanied by a cup of wine and a blessing is actually basically made clear in the Mishnah. It's clearer on the back half of the Hallel, the second part of Hallel, the after meal Hallel. So let's take a look at that very simple Mishnah. Revi'i, the fourth cup, Gomer alav in Hallel. On the fourth cup of wine, you finish Hallel. That's the connection between wine and Hallel. And Gomer alav, and you say upon that Hallel, upon those Psalms, right? So now we're talking Psalm 115 to 118, those four Psalms. You Omer alav birkat ashir. You say this bracha, the bracha of song. Now, this is it's not totally clear what this bracha is, and the Talmud sort of tries to unpack that. We have sort of the answer that ends up in our Haggadah, but just notice the structure: wine, Hallel, bracha. Okay, those are elements that are wrapped up together. And in fact, we even have this notion of the fifth cup, which is a minority opinion that there is such a thing on Seder night, but it is reported in the Talmud named Rabbi Tarfon, Chamishi, a fifth cup, Omer alav Hallel HaGadol. On the fifth cup, if you were to do a fifth cup, and that sort of got elided with Elijah's cup, but in the Talmud, it's not related to Elijah. It's just if you wanted to have another Hallel, something called Hallel HaGadol, the great Hallel, which ends up being Psalm 136, although it's not totally clear what it refers to. But just note the components. Hallel HaGadol, you have a cup of wine, okay? And the way that comes down, also you have a blessing that follows. So wine, Hallel, blessing, okay? So yesterday we looked at Hallel eating Hallel. Now I'm adding in the components of wine and a blessing to each part of the Hallel, okay? So Hallel eating Hallel, but in that first Hallel, you have blessing on wine and a blessing that finishes the Hallel, and you're going to have that in the back half as well. So let's take a look at the blessing that follows our first Hallel, the Perek Rishon, the first recitation of Hallel, Psalm 113 and 114. Okay, this is the blessing, again, that is accompanied with the second cup at the end of Maggid, right after you finish singing those couple songs of Hallel. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, Asher Ge'alanu, who redeemed us, V'gal et avotenu miMitzrayim, and redeemed our ancestors from Egypt. and brought us to this night to eat matzah and maror. The parts in the bold in the Hebrew are the parts that were added later on, but we're going to look at the original bracha in the Mishnah in just a second. Let's just get the bracha on the table. So too, Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu, Lord our God, God of our ancestors, bring us to other appointed times and holidays that will come to greet us in peace, joyful in the building of your city, and happy in your worship. That we shall eat there from the offerings and from the Pesach sacrifices, the blood of which shall reach the wall of your altar for favor. That line is often cut out in some Haggadot in the modern period. And we shall thank you with a new song upon our redemption and upon the restoration of our souls. Blessed are you, Hashem, who redeemed Ga'al Yisrael. We saw yesterday that wasn't really originally in the past, but really a present tense. Goel, blessed you, God, who redeems Israel, as opposed to who redeemed Israel. Okay, but let's just take a look at this bracha, right? There's basically two parts to the bracha. First of all, there's the thank you for bringing us to this night and having redeemed us and our ancestors. Okay, that's the first, we have arrived here. But then there's actually a request. Bring us in the future to other opportunities to celebrate and to eat. And that's when we'll be able to offer sacrifices and thank you. So there's sort of both a thank you, blessed are you, God, for redeeming us in the past, and keep doing this in the future. Bring us somewhere in the future. Those are two components of the blessing, the past and the request for the future, which were not always obviously two elements that come together. Let's take a look at where this shows up in the Mishnah. Remember, we saw that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel asked, how much of Hallel do you say in the Maggid section of the Haggadah? Beit Shammai says you say up to 113, Psalm 113. Beit Hillel says, no, you even say B'tzeit Yisrael Mimitzrayim. That's what we spoke about. We even say Psalm 114 about leaving Egypt, even though we haven't left yet. But then notice what Beit Hillel says in the Mishnah, V'chotem Ge'ulah. And you do a bracha that concludes with, a blessing that concludes with Ge'ulah, with redemption, which makes sense for Beit Hillel, because they're talking about a psalm that includes redemption from Egypt. So Beit Shammai isn't really talking about redemption at this point in the night because they haven't been redeemed. But Beit Hillel is saying, yes, even though we haven't been redeemed, we're nevertheless talking about leaving Egypt, and we're nevertheless gonna conclude that psalm with a blessing about redemption. Okay, so the structure of Hallel followed by the bracha is sort of laid out in this Mishnah, and the subject of that blessing that follows Hallel is Ge'ulah, is redemption. Indeed, because we left Egypt. Now, in a later layer of rabbis in the Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, we're going to try to figure out, well, what is the blessing that is about redemption? And indeed, we have a debate. Rabbi Tarfon says it's the first part of that blessing we just read. It's just Asher Ga'alanu B'Galat Avotenu Mimitzrayim, who redeemed us and our ancestors from Egypt and brought us to this night, Ve'eno Chotem, and does not conclude with what's going to be Rabbi Akiva's offering for the conclusion. Okay, so this doesn't mean the technical chatima, but it means like this is where you stop the bracha. What is Rabbi Tarfon focusing on? He's focusing on, we now today know that God redeemed our ancestors from Egypt, and that's what we're blessing God for, right? B'tzeit Yisrael Mimitzrayim, they actually did leave Egypt, and we're going to bless God for redeeming us. And as we know, it's not just our ancestors, but even, us as well, because if God hadn't redeemed us, then we would still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That's Rabbi Tarfon's focus, is on the past. But look at Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the one who brings in the future. Rabbi Akiva is the one who's saying this is not just a blessing, thanking God for having done something to us in the past, redeemed us in the past, but rather there's a request that I'm going to make as well. Kain Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avotenu Yagienu L'Regalim Habaim Likratenu Shalom. So too, Adonai our God, bring us to those upcoming festivals. May they greet us in peace. Okay, and the focus of Rabbi Akiva's addition, this chatima, the second half of this blessing, is really future oriented, because of course Rabbi Akiva is sitting at a time which is not at all related to a period when you could go up to the temple and bring up your sacrifices and put the blood on the wall and all that stuff that was ritual that was associated with the temple that was standing. Now Rabbi Akiva is living in the destruction time. So in a moment of destruction, in a moment of no presence of God in the temple in Jerusalem, you kind of have two choices. And Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva are playing out both of them. Rabbi Tarfon says, you know what? We're thanking God for what happened. Full stop. We're not able to focus on, God coming back to the temple and bringing us forward to a next holiday where we might actually appear in a redeemed world with the temple rebuilt. That's Rabbi Tarfon. I'm just going to report on the past. Rabbi Akiva, however, is not shying away from saying, yeah, tonight is not a celebration only of the past. It is also a request for redemption in the future. And so when Rabbi Akiva says, may you bring us, back to celebrate the next holiday, it's not just like, here we are in April, I'll see you in October for Sukkot, in exile, but rather I want the redemption to be in full force and return us to sort of the promised land and the presence of God in the temple going forward. And that's why it makes sense for Rabbi Akiva to end this. Blessed are you, God, Goel Yisrael, who redeems Israel. Now, again, we saw yesterday, Rava takes that blessing. Rava, generations later in the Babylonian Talmud, says, no, you don't say who redeems Israel. Amar Rava, in the Hallel, Kriyat Shema v'Hallel, in the Hallel of Seder night, you say Goel Yisrael. You're only talking about the past. God redeemed Israel. It's not about a future redemption. But that's not really how the blessing rolls. Like the blessing that we have in our Haggadah does include Rabbi Akiva's section, and in all the old Haggadot and in the Eretz Yisrael Haggadah that doesn't know of Rava's editorial change to the past, it has Goel Yisrael as God redeeming us now. So again, what we see here is the structure of Hallel is accompanied by a blessing that follows it. And that blessing, you can choose. Is that only about the past, Rabbi Tarfon's opinion? Or is it also a prayer for the future, Rabbi Akiva's opinion, which just takes us to this general struggle that we're playing out on Seder night? Is this only remembering something that happened long ago? Or is it also about a request or a promise for the redemption of the future, which was trying to be worked out in some of the liturgy of Haggadah? Okay, we're going to join in tomorrow morning again. And we will see you then.